the 17th of December. The morning mist hung low over the camp, soft and cold. Like a quiet secret, the wind refused to share. Behind the barbed wires, the German women prisoners stirred awake, wrapped in thin blankets that did little to fight the chill. It was another day in captivity, or so they thought. Helena, once a nurse in Berlin, rubbed her hands together for warmth. Around her, whispers passed like the crackle of dry leaves. "They're coming," someone said. The British. A hush fell. These women had seen soldiers before. Men in uniforms, faces hardened by war. But something about the murmurs today felt different. The camp gates creaked open, and in stepped a column of British soldiers. Their khaki coats looked freshly pressed, their boots firm against the frozen ground. But it wasn't the uniform that caught the women's eyes. It was the way they walked, their calm faces, their quiet discipline. No shouting, no angry orders, only the faint sound of boots and the occasional cough in the cold air. For months, the women had lived under fear. Fear of punishment, fear of hunger, fear of what tomorrow might bring. But today, as they watched these British men approach, something stirred inside them that they hadn't felt in years. Curiosity and hope. Helena's friend Lot leaned closer and whispered, "They look different." Helena nodded slowly. "Different," she repeated, her eyes fixed on one of the soldiers, who seemed no older than his jawline was sharp, his eyes soft. A strange mix of authority and gentleness. The British commander, Captain Evans, stopped near the gate and gave a simple order. "Open the supplies. They'll eat properly today." His voice carried no anger, no pride, just matter-of-fact kindness. The women froze. "Eat properly." They exchanged doubtful glances. They had learned not to believe kind words too quickly. Soon, crates of bread, cheese, and canned meat appeared. For women who had survived on watery soup and crumbs, the sight was almost unreal. Helena's throat tightened. She could smell the bread, even from a distance. The warmth, the promise of something human again. One of the guards, a tall man with sandy hair, noticed her staring. He smiled, just slightly, politely, and motioned for her to step forward. Helena hesitated, her instincts warning her to stay back. But the hunger in her stomach was louder than her fear. She took a few steps, her shoes crunching over the frosted ground. The guard offered her a tin plate, his gloved hands steady. "Here," he said softly. "Eat." She reached out, her fingers brushed against his glove, and in that moment, something inside her broke. She hadn't been spoken to kindly by a man in uniform since the war began. Tears stung her eyes, unexpected and hot. She tried to speak to thank him, but the words wouldn't come out. He seemed to understand. "It's all right," he said. "You're safe now." Safe. That word echoed through her mind like a prayer. Around her, began to eat, their trembling hands lifting the food as though it might disappear if they blinked. The British soldiers watched quietly, some exchanging awkward smiles, others looking away, unsure how to act in the face of such raw emotion. Lot laughed suddenly, a fragile, broken laugh, and said, "We've never seen men like this." Her voice cracked, but her eyes shone. The women nearby nodded in silent agreement. These weren't the brutal faces of the enemy they'd imagined. These were men who looked tired, human, and strangely kind. Helena ate slowly, savoring each bite, her eyes drifting toward the young soldier again. He stood near the gate, his rifle slung carelessly over his shoulder, watching the women eat, as though protecting something sacred. Their eyes met again, and this time, neither looked away. For the first time in years, Helena felt seen, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as a woman. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, painting the camp in shades of gold and red, the women sat in quiet reflection. The guards kept their distance, talking softly among themselves, laughing occasionally. The sound of laughter, real laughter, filled the camp for the first time. Lot whispered, "Do you think they'll stay?" Helena smiled faintly. "I don't know," she said, "but I hope they do." The sky above them glowed faintly with the promise of peace. In that moment, behind the wire, surrounded by strangers, the women felt something. They thought the war had taken forever, the faint warmth of humanity returning. And as night fell, Helena wrote in her small torn notebook, "They treated us not as prisoners, but as people." I saw their eyes, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid. The wind blew softly through the camp, carrying away the echoes of the past, and bringing with it, perhaps the first breath of a gentler tomorrow. The days that followed were strangely calm, a silence that carried not the weight of fear, but the soft rhythm of routine. The British guards had replaced the older, harsher overseers, and the entire camp seemed to breathe differently now. Gone were the cruel shouts and the constant suspicion. In their place came quiet orders, steady hands, and the faint hum of a gramophone someone had found and repaired. Helena woke each morning to the sound of boots on gravel and the faint smell of tea drifting through the cold air. She had never tasted tea before, not the way the British made it. On the third morning, one of the guards, the same young man from the first day, Private Allen, stopped by her tent with 2 steaming mugs. "Tea," he said simply, offering her one. She blinked in disbelief. "For me," he nodded, a small grin forming. "Yes, we had extra." She accepted it with trembling hands, the metal cup warm against her skin. "Danke," she whispered softly, the German word slipping out before she could stop it. He chuckled. "You're welcome, Fräulein Helena." Her heart skipped. He knew her name. She wanted to ask how, but the warmth of the tea and his easy smile made the question fade. For a few minutes, they just stood there, the prisoner and the soldier, 2 strangers from opposite sides of a war, sharing silence and steam. As the days turned into weeks, small moments like this began to thread through the camp like light through broken glass. Lot, ever curious and bold, had started teaching one of the British soldiers a few German words. In return, he taught her bits of English. Bread, sky, smile. They laughed often, their laughter echoing past the watchtowers, startling even the birds perched on the wires. The officers noticed, but said nothing. Captain Evans understood something few others did, that sometimes kindness did more to heal than punishment ever could. One afternoon, Helena was helping carry laundry to the washing area when she saw Private Allen again. He was helping another soldier repair a broken fence. Sweat clung to his forehead. His sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms streaked with dirt. For a long moment, she found herself staring, not out of desire, but curiosity. P noticed, wiped his brow, and smiled faintly. "Something wrong, Helena?" She blushed, caught in the act. "No, I was just watching." He laughed softly. "We don't bite. You know." She smiled back, shyly, and for the first time since the war began, she realized how disarming laughter could be. That evening, the women gathered near the campfire. The British guards had allowed them to cook under supervision, of course, and Helena had volunteered to make soup. The smell drew in both prisoners and soldiers alike. Allen approached, hands in his pockets. "What's this?" he asked, peering into the pot. "Something from home," Helena said. "We used to make it before the war." He leaned closer, inhaled, and smiled. "Smells better than what our cook makes." The women laughed, a sound that felt almost foreign after years of fear. They served the guards a little soup, and the men, perhaps out of politeness, perhaps out of genuine curiosity, accepted it. As they ate, one of the older women, Marta, said quietly, "We never thought we'd cook for the British." Allen raised his cup and said, "And we never thought we'd eat with our enemies." He smiled again, adding softly, "But maybe the war made enemies out of people who were never meant to be." The silence that followed was deep and thoughtful. The fire crackled. The stars above shimmered faintly. And in that simple moment of shared food and laughter, the walls between them began to crumble. Later that night, Helena wrote again in her notebook, "I saw them laugh today. I saw them eat our food. Maybe, just maybe, peace begins like this. Not in treaties, but in the way to people choose to share bread." The next morning brought a surprise. Captain Evans called a few of the women, including Helena, to the central yard. "We need help with the garden," he said. "The soil here's good. We're planting vegetables." Felina blinked. A garden in a prison camp. By noon, she was kneeling in the dirt with a small shovel, her hands covered in soil, sunlight touching her face for the first time in months. Across from her, Allen worked quietly, occasionally glancing up with that same easy grin. "You're good at this," he said. She shrugged. "We used to have a small garden in Berlin. My mother loved flowers." "Flowers, huh?" he said. "We could plant some when this all ends." "When this all ends," she repeated softly, tasting the words. The idea of an end, a real end, felt impossible. Yet something in his voice made her believe it. By the end of the day, the camp had changed again. Rows of small plants lined the dirt, their leaves trembling in the breeze. It wasn't much, but it was life, and that meant everything. That night, as Helena looked out at the stars from her tent, she thought about the strange warmth between them, prisoners and guards alike. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something simpler and deeper, trust. For the first time since the war began, she didn't dream of fear. She dreamed of sunlight, of laughter, and of hands, rough, tired, but gentle, handing her a cup of tea in the cold morning air. And as she drifted to sleep, Helena whispered a single line to herself, half prayer, half realization. Sometimes peace wears a uniform too. The frost had started to melt when Helena realized how much the camp had changed. What was once a place of silence and suspicion now hummed with faint life, the sound of boots and laughter, of shovels digging into the thawing soil, of a radio that played scratchy British songs during the evenings. The women had begun to smile again, some even daring to hum tunes from home. Helena often found herself near the garden, tending to the small rows of vegetables that she and the soldiers had planted weeks earlier. The earth had come alive, green shoots stretching toward the weak winter sun. Alan was usually nearby, leaning on his rifle, pretending to supervise while secretly sketching in a small notebook he kept tucked in his pocket. One afternoon, she noticed him sitting on a crate, charcoal smudging his fingers. "You draw?" she asked, wiping her hands on her skirt as she approached. He smiled, without looking up. "Only when there's something worth drawing." Her brow furrowed, curiosity flickering. "And what's worth drawing here?" "Barbed wire." Finally, he turned the notebook toward her. On the page was a delicate pencil sketch, the garden, the tents, in the background and in the center, a woman bending over the soil. The woman's hair was tied loosely, her face calm but strong. Helena froze. If it was her, she felt her heart skip, her throat tighten. "Why? Why me?" He shrugged, trying to seem casual. "You looked peaceful, like someone who still believes things can grow again." "Not what?" he asked, stepping closer. She looked up at him, the firelight flickering on her face. "Not you." He froze, the air between them heavy, fragile. For a moment, the war vanished. There was no enemy, no orders, no camp. Just a man and a woman who had somehow found each other in the wreckage. Alan reached into his pocket and pulled out the little bird sketch. "Then take this," he said softly, "so you don't forget." Her eyes filled. She reached out for fingers, brushing his, a spark of warmth in the freezing night. "Thank you," she whispered. Before either of them could say more, a voice shouted from the barracks, the changing of the guards. Alan straightened instantly, his face snapping back into duty. "Go inside," he said quietly. "Someone might see." She nodded, clutching the paper tightly to her chest. "Good night." "Good night, Helena." When she lay down that night, she didn't sleep. She stared at the dim lantern above her, heart aching with something she couldn't name, a mix of longing and fear. She knew this was dangerous, forbidden, but she also knew it was real. For the first time since the war began, Helena realized that not every uniform carried cruelty. Some carried compassion, and sometimes that was enough to make the world feel worth surviving again. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small drawing, the bird he had given her weeks ago. The paper was creased, but she had kept it safe, folded close to her heart. "I'll keep this," she said softly, "so I don't forget." He looked down at it, then back at her. "You don't need the paper," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Just remember the sky." She wanted to cry, but no tears came. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint freckles on her cheeks, smell the faint scent of soap and earth. "Will we ever meet again?" she asked. He forced a smile. "If the world allows it." The trucks began to rumble. The women climbed aboard, the soldiers helping them with quiet respect. Helena turned back one last time, her scarf fluttering in the wind. Alan stood motionless by the gate, his cap pulled low, his jaw tight. Their eyes met one final time, a glance that carried everything they couldn't say. Gratitude, sorrow, and something softer that neither dared to name. As the truck rolled away, she pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the folded sketch beneath her dress. Alan watched until the dust swallowed them from view. Then he reached into his pocket and unfolded a torn scrap of paper, one he had taken from her old notebook when she wasn't looking. He smiled sadly, tucking it back inside his coat. Years later, when the war was just a memory, and he was an old man, tending a quiet garden in the countryside, he still kept that note in a tin box beside the bird sketch. Sometimes, when spring came and the flowers bloomed again, he would look to the sky and whisper softly, "Greater than..." "You were right, Helena. The sky never forgets."